I'm Tony DeMaria, the editor of JACC, here with the highlights of the December 4th issue. One of the well-accepted axioms in medicine is that salt reduction is important, particularly in hypertension, and very important in reducing the risk for heart attack and stroke. But the question exists as to whether the benefit of salt reduction is merely related to the reduction of blood pressure or whether there are other mechanisms. And to test this, a group of investigators who are publishing in JACC took a group of hypertensive middle-aged individuals and initially put them on a low sodium diet and then subsequently on a high salt diet and examined the effect of salt upon endothelial function. And what they found was that the low salt diet clearly improved and ameliorated both macrovascular and microvascular endothelial function, looking at brachial artery reactivity according to standard techniques. Now, the mechanism of this seemed to be related to NO, nitric oxide availability, possibly through involvement of nitric oxide synthetase and the ability to reduce oxidative stress. Nevertheless, another reason to have our patients reduce their salt intake, not only for the benefit on blood pressure, but also for the benefit on endothelial function. In the December 4th issue of JACC, Dr. Burnett and Associates evaluated the unique strategy of subcutaneous BNP administration in patients with heart failure. Their major objective was to assess the safety and potentially the efficacy of this unusual treatment. And so it was a relatively short study conducted over a period of about 8 weeks where patients received about 10 mics per kilogram of body weight of BNP subcutaneously twice a day. What was observed was that, in fact, this was clearly very safe. There were no adverse events. And more importantly, there was a significant reduction in left ventricular volumes and left ventricular mass in the patients who received the subcutaneous BNP. There were also some secondary endpoints like an improvement in Minnesota Living with Heart Failure score and left ventricular ejection fraction. So another modality perhaps we can bring to bear on our patients with heart failure, especially those who are anxious to keep out of the hospital, if they can self-inject BNP subcutaneously twice a day. A more definitive study clearly is indicated based on these findings. Despite the voluminous data on PCI, it's interesting that there's a relative scarcity of information regarding the value of PCI in elderly diabetics. So to assess this, Dr. Pam Douglas and colleagues went to the NCDR database of over 400,000 patients undergoing PCI and examined the subgroup of diabetics over the age of 65. And they subdivided this group into insulin-requiring diabetics and non-insulin requiring diabetics. What they found was, to no surprise, that the diabetics had a higher incidence of both death and myocardial infarction in the follow-up period after PCI, about twice the risk in insulin-requiring diabetics, about 30% increase in non-insulin requiring diabetics. They also had a higher incidence of the need for revascularization and post-PCI bleeding. On a positive note, drug-eluting stents were found to reduce both death and MI in the insulin-requiring diabetics, but only death in the non-insulin requiring diabetics. So some important information, again, affirming the fact that elderly diabetics are at higher risk undergoing PCI, but nevertheless that the procedure can still produce some significant benefits. An interesting article in this issue relates to the cost effectiveness of pre-participation ECG screening in athletes. And this, of course, has been very controversial. The European Society of Cardiology recommends screening, whereas the American Heart Association does not recommend screening with an electrocardiogram. And there's one study from Italy that has demonstrated that pre-participation ECG screening can, in fact, save lives. So Dr. Sammy Viskin took the data from this study and applied it to the United States to see how much it would cost. And what he found was very provocative. He found that it would cost approximately $10 to $14 million per life saved if one did indeed make policy that all athletes should undergo pre-participation ECG screening. Now, the reason for this was largely related to the cost of procedures in the United States. And it can be argued, and was argued in a commentary, that in fact you could do pre-participation screening much more economically, reducing the price of ECGs and not having specialist cardiologists involved. So a very interesting paper, sure to add fuel to the fire as to whether or not we should routinely do ECGs prior to our athletic participation, especially in our elite athletes. So very interesting articles in this December 4th issue. I hope you'll enjoy reading them.